Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, where we take an in-depth look at how news from around the world is impacting Taiwan. I'm James Chater. Japan recently hosted the G7 summit in Hiroshima. It was the first big meeting of global leaders the country's hosted since it decided to hike its defense budget by more than 25%. That came as Tokyo also announced a major overhaul of its previously pacifist defense strategy, which some say was conceived with a potential conflict over Taiwan in mind. But how is all of this changing perceptions of Japan's role within the region's security? To discuss all this, we're joined by Ken Jimbo in Tokyo. Ken is a professor at the Faculty of Policy Management at Keio University. Ken, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Ken, before we begin, I want to play you part of a report I filed from Hiroshima, where some had come out in opposition to the G7. Just a few hundred meters away from the visiting dignitaries, around 100 protesters demonstrated against the G7, saying the group only exacerbates existing global tensions.
G7 が決して戦争に反対する勢力だとは思っていません。むしろここにも書かせてもらいましたけど、G7 は戦争推進勢力だと。
The demonstrators also decry what they see as Japan's move away from its pacifist constitution, which has been in place since the end of World War II. This G7 summit is the first international gathering hosted by Japan since it announced a massive hike in its security spending, as regional tensions mount over China's growing assertiveness. To begin, Ken, tell us what Japan's new defense strategy is and how it differs from what the country had before.
Sure. Japan has adopted a new national security strategy together with a defense strategy and the defense build-up plan. We call it three strategic documents. These are quite historical in a way that Japan has adopted to double the size of its defense budget by 2027. We are now looking at the more robust kind of active denial strategy vis-a-vis, becoming quite a severe security environment surrounding Japan.
We'll talk about the movement to procure some of those offensive capabilities in a second. But first of all, just explain how significant, the historical significance of this new strategy is. Obviously, Japan's had its pacifist constitution since the end of the Second World War. Just explain the historical significance of what's going on right now.
Sure. Japan has long maintained the Constitution Article 9, which prohibits Japan to engage in a war. We are limiting ourselves to deal with only with a defensive purpose of engaging in those combats. But in terms of how we try to develop our capability, we are now looking at the kind of long-range strike capability that is somewhat changed the scope of the geographical engagement of how the defense strategy should be implemented. And the second, I think, difference is that we have long maintained the defense budget level to the 1% of the GDP. But in terms of the, how we can really afford to defend ourselves, the 1% only remains to have very much like a limited option for us. So the decision to increase the defense budget level to the 2% by 2027 is also kind of alters the historical kind of sequence of how such kind of level of the defense budget has been maintained.
And from the perspective of Japan, what is really driving this change? Obviously, Japan has three threats that it faces. It has Russia, it has North Korea, and it also has China's growing assertiveness as well. Explain for us what the threat perception is from the perspective of Japan and why that's catalyzing this shift.
Definitely. I think you're right that Japan is now facing three threats simultaneously, namely China, North Korea, and Russia. And what makes us different in the previous strategy back in 2012-13 timeframe, 10 years before, is that I think China is constantly rising in terms of its military capability. And the gap between the Japanese capability vis-a-vis China has been widening so rapidly. At the same time, China is now almost confirming its own anti-access capability even towards the United States. And the second, I think, big difference is the role of Russia, because 10 years ago, Japan was quite positive in engaging Russia diplomatically, because that in terms of how we can really, allocate China as the first layer strategic context, we didn't really have a luxury to deal with, three different enemies at the same time. But after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, such kind of tactical measures towards Russia has no longer has the strategic benefits for Japan.
And I want to play devil's advocate for a second, because obviously there were these protesters at the G7 summit who were kind of opposing the summit being held in Japan, and said that Japan hiking its defense budget was actually exacerbating tensions in the region. Isn't that true to an extent? Why is it that Japan has fallen on this side of the equation, that given this increasingly tense situation, that they've decided that hiking the defense budget is the right way to go about things? Does that not increase tensions in the region?
Sure, but first of all, I think a G7 summit has been widely appreciated positively in the Japanese public. Highlighting of the anti-nuclear and the disarmament types of the agenda were demonstrated by like a G7 leaders jointly offer the condolences to the victims of the atomic bombs in Hiroshima in front of the memorial. And President Zelensky has also joined the G7. In terms of your question, I think there has been the wider support in Japan over increase of our defense budget, according to the many public poll, conducted in past 12 months. But at the same time, there has been the remaining strong, constituency or the tendency, especially for the pacifist, to maintain their ideological stance that such kind of increase of the budget will only exacerbate the tension of the concerned parties.
Ken, I want to talk now about Japan's security relationship with Taiwan. Can you explain what exactly that relationship is? There's no formal agreement for Japan to protect Taiwan in the event of a contingency. How is Japan thinking about a potential invasion of Taiwan at the moment?
Sure. Since 1972, Japan-China basic agreement. Basically, Japan adhered to the One China policy. Likewise, many of those international community regard the status of Taiwan. So, which has a structural limitation over how Japan and Taiwan can interact in terms of the military domain. So we don't have direct military-to-military contacts between Japan and Taiwan. But at the same time, it doesn't really mean that the Japan and Taiwan don't have a security relationship. And Japan is the major ally of the United States, and the United States has its own Taiwan Relations Act to engage in the defense of Taiwan. So indirectly, there has been a connection over how we commit to the defense of Taiwan, not in the very visible direct sense, but through United States and through diplomatic channel, we've been engaging the defense of Taiwan.
And of course, there's a big US military presence in Japan. The former Japanese Prime Minister Abe also had this now quite well-known statement that a Taiwan contingency has implications for Japan. Do you think there is more or less consensus within Japan's political and security establishment now that if a contingency over Taiwan were to happen, that Japan would become involved in that conflict?
Yes, this concept is quite notorious in mainland China with obvious reason, because for them, Taiwan is a domestic issue. But from Japanese perspective, Taiwan and Japan's southwest island, from Okinawa way down to the southwestern remote island, is called the Yonaguni Island, and which is only 100 kilometers away from mainland Taiwan. So it's a military rationale that we are talking, that if China conducts such kind of large-scale operation, it definitely affects the defense of Japan.
You mentioned the role of Okinawa and these southwestern islands, which are very, very close to Taiwan. Could you give us some more specifics on what a Japanese involvement in a potential conflict over Taiwan would look like? Obviously, there was recently some reporting about anti-ship missiles, I think it were, being stationed on these southwestern islands. When I was recently in Hiroshima as well, the naval base near there, Kure, is home to Japan's submarines, which I understand would also play a very, very critical role in a potential conflict. Could you give us some more details on what you think a Japanese involvement would look like in that situation?
Sure. Japanese self-defense force has been active in the peacetime ISR operation. Those are the reconnaissance and intelligence sharing operation in East China Sea and also at the underwater through the submarines. And those information have been deeply shared with the United States. And the contingency is another version of our operations. It hasn't been, I think, streamlinedly defined yet. But as you mentioned, that as we are going to procure the long-range strike capability, mainly on the anti-ship missiles, and it's said to be that we are procuring the range of 1,500 kilometers. And 1,500 kilometers is exactly the range from Kyushu to Taiwan Straits, which means that if we, install such kind of a series of the battery group in Kyushu, which has a strong implication that we are going to engage the Chinese ships in Taiwan Straits. It's not been on the paper. It's not been, addressed in the official documents. And this is what we try to address. That is what we want the Chinese strategic thinker to calculate. Such kind of, engagement could happen.
And then just one final question, which is on NATO. Just before the G7 summit, there was news that NATO was planning to set up its first liaison office in Japan. What does this tell us, and what role would that office potentially play in a potential conflict over Taiwan?
Well, I think that there has been more meaningful strategic interconnectivity between transatlantic alliance versus trans-Pacific alliance. In a way that, as Prime Minister Kishida once called that today's Ukraine could be tomorrow's East Asia, which means that how European friends have been struggling against how to counter the Russian threat in the European front, definitely has a strong meaning in how to deter the conflict in Asia. So setting up the NATO kind of liaison office in Japan would have a strong meaning that NATO will be, committing to the situation in East Asia. And I think from the Japanese perspective, the Europe can bring in a lots of, I think, impetus for making the such kind of East Asian conflict to be more global. China tends to define that all things could be domestic. Taiwan, Senkaku, Diaoyu Islands, and South China Sea. For them, it's all things are domestic. But once that Europe, comes to the table, and then things could get really global in a way. So this is the kind of force multiplier for confirming our status quo capability by having a more European engagement in this region.
Ken, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to our viewers too. This has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. You can find TaiwanPlus on Facebook and Twitter. We'll see you next time.